Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. If you've been following the last few episodes, you'll know we're about to reach and touch the heart of this great mystery of Platonic love. We're making our way through Plato's Symposium, and we've reached a critical point, the point at which Socrates introduces us to Diotima of Mantinea, the woman who, he says, taught him what he knows about Eros. And her teaching, as narrated by Socrates, is at the core of Plato's transformative philosophy of love and desire. One of the interesting things about the symposium is that despite the quiet impasse that I talked about a couple of episodes ago, this conflict that the first 5 speakers at this drinking party have had, a feeling inclined to praise Eros unreservedly, but at the same time being, I think, all too keenly aware that they can't do so truthfully or at least seriously. Socrates doesn't suddenly announce the resolution of all this. For Socrates to suddenly unveil a solution, perhaps to suddenly reveal a false assumption that has been holding these speakers back without their knowing it, would be both dramatic but also, I think, clear. But this isn't really how the symposium works. Socrates has a solution which he claims to have learned from Diotima, but instead of suddenly revealing it, he rather wades into it. We actually saw a bit of that wading last time, and we'll see it again today. I'll be talking about that later in this episode, but first I'd like to talk a bit about this person, Diotima. Han pot ekusa gunaikos mantinikes Diotimas, things which I once heard from a Mantinean woman, Diotima, Socrates says. Various things in his introduction of Diotima into this conversation suggest a kind of knowledge outside the mundane, or if you like, outside that abstract thought that typifies our species and perhaps our age. Outside, you might say, the clear and distinct ideas that René Descartes strove for. In the words of Walter Lamb, the scholar who translated the symposium for the Loeb Classical Library, quote, these names, Mantinikes of Mantinea and Diotima, suggest a connection respectively with prophecy and with the favor of heaven. Mantinikes sounds an awful lot like mantike, which means prophetic, a prophetic woman actually, as it's in the feminine. And in Diotima we have Dio, a form of Zeus, and Tima, which comes from the verb timao, to honor. And so her name means she who honors Zeus, or alternatively, she who's honored by Zeus, though that seems kind of unlikely to me. Timao also has this sense of fearing, and it seems bizarre for me to think of Zeus sort of fearfully honoring any mortal. Anyway, according to Socrates, Diotima at one point guided Athenians in their sacrifices in such a way as to put off the arrival of a plague by 10 years, though of course we have no idea if she was a real or fictional person. And as we'll see, she also seems especially knowledgeable, or at least quite confident in her knowledge, of divine and semi-divine beings. You might remember that Socrates began his speech by refuting Agathon's claim that Eros is the most beautiful and best thing. He now tells us that he himself used to have a similar view of Eros, but that it was Diotima who convinced him otherwise. He says twice, actually, that he actually agrees with Agathon on this idea that to understand Eros, one must first understand of what kind it is, and then what it actually does. And one of the first things Diotima teaches Socrates is that Eros is a daimon. Actually, she says a great daimon. A being, she says, in between the mortal and divine, and also between beautiful and ugly, and good and bad. That's the kind of thing Eros is. Daimon, of course, sounds to us an awful lot like demon, and it's in fact where the word comes from. But I think it's quite important for us here not to bring anything demonic to this ancient Greek concept of the daimon. To the Greeks, daimon was simply another word for God or divine power. For example, they had this expression, kata daimona, by the favor of the divine power, i.e., by chance or God willing, you could say. By daimon, they sometimes meant a person's protective spirit, a bit like their guardian angel. You might know this Latin word genius, which is the Latin equivalent. And Socrates himself, in another work, the Apology, famously speaks of being at times under the influence of a daimonion, or daimonic voice, one that he says has a mantike, or prophetic art, of keeping him from doing unwise things. Eudaimonia, good-spiritedness, you might say, meant happiness to the Greeks. This prefix eu or oi, it means well, or you could say good. And so we put it in front of daimonia to mean good spirit, good-spiritedness. Similarly, we put it in, it's a prefix you also see in euthanasia, for example. And then meaning a good death, or euphemism, a good saying. Anyway, so that meant happiness to the Greeks. And then finally, the Greeks sometimes use the word to convey the concept of a semi-divine being, as Diotima does here. It was in a way by chance, actually, that our modern English version of demon, came to have the sense that it does. When the Hebrew Bible was being translated into Greek, they used the Greek word angelos, or messenger, to translate the Hebrew malach. The malachim are these fiery agents of God. But then a word was needed to render the Hebrew shadim and seirim, which were foreign gods and evil spirits, and translators ended up using the Greek word daimonia. This precedent having been set, the word daimon became the word normally used in the Greek New Testament for an evil spirit. But this sense could hardly be further than that, than what the Greeks of Plato's time meant by the word, which was actually, I think, not too different from the meaning conveyed by our word angel today, at least in some contexts. And I think what we have here with Diotima is one of those. Socrates asks Diotima what kind of power daimons have, and she replies that they're a kind of messenger from the gods. The role of the daimonic, she says, is interpreting and ferrying to gods things from human beings, and to human beings things from gods. The requests and sacrifices of human beings, the orders and exchanges for sacrifices of gods. For it is in the middle of both and fills up the interval so that the whole itself has been bound together by it, the daimonic. Through this proceeds all divination and the art of the priests who deal with sacrifices, initiatory rituals, incantations, and every kind of soothsaying and magic. A god does not mingle with a human being, but through this, the daimonic, occurs the whole intercourse. And the Greek word that's rendered here by this translator as intercourse is homilia, which can mean conversation or lecture, hence our word homily. But it can also mean company or intercourse with, including sexual intercourse with someone. So we could be looking at another sexual pun here. But in any case, I think what Diotima is trying to get at clearly is the idea of intimacy, that it's the daimonic that makes us intimate with the divine. So through the daimonic occurs the whole intercourse and conversation of gods with human beings while they are awake and asleep. They're looking at dreaming as a daimonic messages from God, this altered state of consciousness. And he who is wise, she says, in things like this is a daimonic man. But he who is wise in anything else, concerning either arts or handicrafts, she means ways of manipulating nature, basically, is vulgar and low. These daimons are many and of all kinds, and one of them is Eros. So I think to most of us reading this in the 21st century West, a lot of it's going to sound perhaps primitive, outdated, the product of an age that was dark in a way because it lacked modern science. But I think what Diotima is saying here can actually be expressed in language many of us would find acceptable today. I think essentially what she's saying is that daimons are more or less what we would call forces today. The divine, you could say, is the world of things in their truth or their destiny. And the world is in motion, you might say, because all things are trying to get to where they truly belong. For example, once an apple's connection with the branch is cut, its true place is to be lower down, to the point where it rests against the earth. And so you could say, the daimon of gravity relays the divine to the apple. It transmits to the apple the truth of where it should be, so that the apple falls. This is what Diotima means by the daimonic being, I think, in the middle of the divine, the true, and the mortal, the natural world, and filling up the interval, quote, so that the whole itself has been bound together by it. To me, it also seems that you could say it's the daimonic, or force, that connects the past and the future. It's force that drives things forward and fills up the gap between how things are and how they ought to be, with an infinite number of moments in between. What Diotima is saying about Eros here is really kind of astonishing. Eros is a daimon that conveys messages to the gods from us, and messages from us, to us from the gods. In other words, it's a force in human nature, an urge or drive that connects the natural to the true, something that speaks to our destiny in some way. If that's true, it seems we do well to understand the speech of this daimon as well as we can. It seems we'd either need to have a good daimonologist to consult, a Diotima of our own, or possibly be good daimonologists to ourselves, if we want to understand the daimonic voice inside us and live in truth and fulfillment. Or possibly we could be daimonologists for each other in some way. I'm mindful here of Martin Luther's teaching. You might have heard that he once wrote that all Christians are priests, that they should each minister to one another. Perhaps there's an argument that human beings are in some way called to be daimonologists for each other. Anyway, what I've just said is related to what I mentioned a bit earlier about Socrates wading into his solution of the problem of Eros rather than announcing it up front. And I'd like to talk a bit about that now. Actually, this wading at this point really takes the form of Socrates and Diotima eroding our certainties or assumptions about what it is exactly that they mean by Eros, in the sense that if it is a force in human nature, or you might say urge or drive, what is it a drive for? I mean, one might think we're talking simply about the desire for sex here, but as the first speakers, especially Aristophanes, argued, Eros is not something that seems really and finally satisfied by a physical act. As those earlier speakers have done, Socrates and Diotima continue to talk about Eros as being a desire not for sexual union really, or exactly, but for beautiful and good things. But we might feel they're losing us a bit here. For one thing, the beautiful and the good seems too broad a category to describe the object of Eros as we conventionally understand it. Moreover, is Eros always for beautiful and good things? Sexuality has never really been something that we humans have found easy to make sense of ethically, although many of us have claimed to. And now, perhaps most unsettling of all, Diotima is saying that Eros conveys to us messages from the gods, messages from the realm of truth. How can we square this with the idea of Eros that many of us have as an essentially irrational drive? And so we may have an uncomfortable feeling here of wondering if we really understand what Socrates and Diotima mean by Eros, or if they're going somewhere where we won't really be able to follow them. Well, I think we will be able to follow them, although the way may not seem clear right now. But after all, we've barely stepped into the ocean of Platonic love. We'll continue wading deeper in the next few episodes. For now, thanks for watching, and see you next time.